All right, we are good to go.
Okay. Good evening and welcome again to our webinar on the whole process of solving the financial challenges that come with the college search process. Webinar tonight is all about the negotiation, the appeal process. Their first offer doesn't have to be your first price, your final price. I'm Mark Salisbury, and I want to thank Next Gen Personal Finance for sponsoring this series and all of the awesome people in the counseling office at Castro Valley High School. So let's talk about our agenda first. Start with, we're gonna just answer the question. You can negotiate, because for many of you, this might be the first time you've actually heard that. Second, we're going to give a little bit of a background on why it is that colleges would even consider lowering their price. Third, we're going to talk about when this process starts and when it happens in the college admissions process, because it's different for everyone based on a couple of different factors. Number four, what are my odds of success and where are my odds of success best? It's really helpful to know that as you go into this process. And then fifth, we'll talk about a framework for how to go about negotiating with a college or university after you've finally gotten a financial aid offer letter. So to start with, what? You can negotiate? Well, yes. And I want to give you a little bit of a backstory here. Before the 1980s, colleges applied a much simpler pricing philosophy. They started out with a lower price, closer to the actual price that they were going to charge students. And then they rarely offered any discounts. And when they did, it was only to give somebody some financial aid based on their need. So when someone would come to a college and say, I'm really not sure I can afford this price, the process that they used was entirely informal, and it really was on a very case-by-case basis, but it was pretty rare. But in the late 1980s, private colleges introduced a new pricing model, and others adopted this later, both in private institutions and eventually in public institutions. Instead of starting out with a low price, they decided, you know what, we're going to start out with a really high price. And we're going to argue that that high price is only because we're so good at what we do. And then we're going to be much more generous, much more willing to give out discounts to many of the students that we accept through the application process. And we're going to use that part of the process as a way to make you feel really special. So as colleges started to do this, it became more common for students to see that really high sticker price, be told that they would get some scholarship money somewhere. And then when they got some scholarship money, it didn't quite meet their own needs. And so the colleges began to formalize a process by which you would appeal. And you would ask, you know what, in order to make this work, I need to have a little bit more financial aid. So that process became a little bit more common and more formalized. And colleges would sort of do it the same way. By the early 2000s, this high price, high discount approach had spawned two big things. First, all of a sudden there was this sticker price arms race, because as you recall, I'd mentioned colleges started to say, well, the reason our price is so high is because we're so good. So then the college down the street would say, well, we're better than you are, so our price has to be high too. And pretty soon you got this keep up with the Joneses approach, so that colleges were all raising their sticker prices very quickly. And then underneath that, family income and people's financial situations didn't change that much. So even though the sticker prices were going up faster and faster, they still had to discount more and more and more to get back down to the place where families could actually pay the price. And pretty soon colleges started to see that and hear from students that they accepted and that they had given financial aid to. Wait a minute, I got financial aid from that other school as well, and you didn't give me as much as they did. I'd kind of like to get to go to your school, but you got to meet what the school down the street gave. So now there becomes this pressure for those colleges to actually change their financial aid offer at the last minute. And sure enough, some colleges start doing that, especially the ones that are really trying to land that big fish student. Colleges sometimes call them trophy students. So sticker prices then began to scare people away. As you can imagine, you get this sticker price arms race going along, and eventually people are seeing these numbers and saying, well, that's crazy. There's no way I can afford that. Some colleges started to say, you know what, we better tell price, otherwise we won't get any applications. We'll get fewer of them. The colleges started to be more public and be more willing to say, look, if the cost that we're asking you to charge isn't quite to your liking or isn't what you can do, we'll give you a chance to appeal. But when anybody ever said, well, I heard that you're willing to negotiate if I've got a better offer somewhere else, no. We would never negotiate. We don't stoop to that level. We don't do that. So colleges were starting to say, okay, we've got an appeal process, but don't treat it like a negotiation. Don't think we're negotiating with you. We're just being kind and listening to your appeal. But those stories, they kept making it around the neighborhood, more and more anecdotal evidence. Parents telling other parents about some success in taking one offer to another school and the other school saying, okay, well, we'll meet that offer. So even though the colleges were denying it, the stories kept going. Now, in the last couple of years, this has sort of really taken a big shift because in the 2020 FAFSA Simplification Act, you know, that act that changed the FAFSA, that made it so easy for everybody this year, of course. It's not been difficult at all. You've all just breezed through. Okay, sorry. Yeah, the one that made the whole FAFSA fiasco this year that everybody's trying to tough their way through. But part of that legislation also said colleges, you cannot any longer just simply refuse to hear someone's appeal. If a consumer wants to appeal a financial aid offer, you have to have a process that you'll listen to that appeal. You don't have to grant it, but you have to listen to it. So by 2022, a couple of years after that legislation passes, we're still trying to figure out how to get the new FAFSA in place. But before that, the legislation passes, the schools have to put that in place right away. Yes, there's a pandemic in here that really throws some kerosene on that fire. But by 2022, a third of families are appealing their financial aid offers. This is data from the giant student loan company, Sallie Mae, who surveys all of their customers each summer and asks them if they asked for more aid. A third of those folks are saying, yeah, we absolutely appealed and asked for more financial aid. It's becoming a fairly common behavior. So out of this, I want you to just remember the first rule of getting a better price. Don't say the word negotiate. Colleges hate that. It has something to do with ego. It has something to do with history. Some of these folks are just real sticklers for terminology, but use the word appeal. You would like to appeal the financial aid offer. In the back of your mind, you can be planning on negotiating, you can plan on haggling, whatever you want to do. But when you talk to the school, tell them that you want to appeal. Why would they listen? It's a good question, right? We tend to be really nervous about, the public tends to be really nervous about colleges and their prices. And they think, why would the colleges change their prices? After all, isn't it really, really hard to get into some of these schools? Well, another thing that's worth knowing. In the 1990s and early 2000s, as this whole process is starting to become a thing, colleges are busy. There are tons of people that want to go to college. And at that point, you can think about it in terms of that economic terminology of supply and demand, right? Where if there's a lot more demand than there is supply, well, then you can charge what you want. Colleges built all kinds of new buildings. They imagined lots of growth. They were going to just love this new phase where they were in control and they could really dictate price. But by the late 2000s, two things. And those things shape this switch. So suddenly there's a lot less demand and the colleges have all this supply because they've built for it. Remember all those buildings? Now the colleges have to pay for them. And this is where things get nuts. 2009 to 2022, the number of folks enrolled in higher education drops by 1.6 million students. Why? Well, part of it is the number of students graduating from high school just starts to flatten out. They're not continuing to be more and more students graduating from high school. In the 90s, there was this big increase. And then there was the 2008 financial crisis that really bit into a lot of people's financial situation. And even after the pandemic, colleges have had a really hard time. Half of them, at least, have not been able to recruit enough students. Some of you might know that some of the Cal State schools right in the Bay Area are now 25% smaller in enrollment than they were before. I think Sonoma State is actually 33% smaller than it was 15 years ago. So all of that puts tremendous pressure on colleges and universities, right? Because there's a far fewer students, but you've built all these buildings. You got to pay for them. You got to get the students to come to your school, right? So now you're much more willing to come up with a price that they'll say yes to. So remember that third of students that are appealing by 2022? 2/3 of those that appealed got more financial aid. Those are pretty good odds. If all you got to do is just ask for more financial aid and you get it. That's what's going on in this phase of the process. The second rule of getting a better price: know the realities of this marketplace. The colleges don't like to announce all this stuff. They put out big press releases whenever they have a record enrollment in the freshman class. That's supposed to indicate how fantastic they are and how popular they are. But their reality is this is not a market for them that's got lots of students. And so they are scrambling to negotiate and get people to come. When does this process start? It's kind of a good question. And it's different for every school and for every student type. And I'm going to show you how those differences play out. Because every college's admission cycle has its own cadence based on how difficult it is to get into that school and how much that school is really trying to fill most of their class with early decision versus regular decision. After being accepted, there's 4 factors that determine when, and even if, a college will be likely to increase aid after you appeal. Okay, the first one, which part of the application process did you choose? Did you go early decision? Did you apply early action? Gives you a little bit more wiggle room, or are you in the regular decision pool? And it's really important to understand this stuff. If you've gone early decision, you're expected to decide right away. So if they send you a financial aid offer that's still more expensive than you can afford, you need to respond right away and appeal that immediately. With early action, you've got a little bit more wiggle room, right? Because you're not compelled to decide once you get a decision. And in regular decision, you're later in the process anyway. So you're going to have the appeal happen later in the process. So that's just factor number one. Factor number two, though, intersects with one, and here's how. It's the acceptance rate. The school, how sort of selective, how popular that place is. If their acceptance rate is less than a third, that means there's a ton of students that want to go there and not so many that get accepted, which also means, by the way, that then that school probably has a nice long wait list, right? For schools that have a nice long wait list and they've got an acceptance rate of less than a third, you're going to want to appeal sooner than later, because the longer you wait, the more likely it is that they've already filled up their class. And once they fill up their class, they're not really going to be interested in giving you a better price, because they can let you walk if you choose to go somewhere else. Versus on the other end, if the college's acceptance rate is more than 2/3, which, by the way, the average across all colleges and universities, the acceptance rate is 64%, pretty close to 2/3. That's the average. If you're looking at schools with the acceptance rate in that category, well, that means that they're accepting an awful lot of students who apply because they know they got to get students. They don't have the luxury of being that selective. And so that would push back when you should appeal a little bit later in the process. Finally, or I shouldn't say finally, but number three, because there's one more after that, isn't there? I can count to four, I promise. What's the yield rate? And the yield rate, by the way, is the percentage of accepted applicants that actually enroll. Yield rate at places like, well, like West Point or like Harvard or like Stanford, they're very, very high, right? Schools like, pick a small college that not very many people have heard of. Let's pick one. I'm going to pick Westminster College in Salt Lake City. Their yield rate's not very high at all. It's less than 25%. So if a school's if their yield rate's really high, that means that once those acceptances go out, a lot of people are going to say yes, and you need to appeal early, because if you wait too long, then all those spots are going to be full, and the school isn't all that interested in listening to your appeal. But if their yield rate's tiny, that means they hear no a lot. And that means you appeal, you're a potential yes. And the longer you wait, the more that school's really, really needs a yes. And finally, how much do they need you? You kind of ask this question: would your demographic profile increase the college's number of underrepresented student types? Now, yes, we've had all kinds of conversations about affirmative action in the last year or two, and the Supreme Court's decision sort of pushing colleges to think about things a different way. But that's not the only demographic profile type, okay? There are lots of schools that just struggle to get enough men on their campus. Some schools, they have a hard time having 1/3 of the student body be men. Other schools, they're trying to get a certain set of majors to sort of get more popular. Some schools just need a particular instrument in the band, an oboe. If you fit into any one of those categories, that can help you negotiate. The third rule of getting a better price: know their admissions cycle. A lot of the data that I just referenced, the admit rate, the yield rate, that information you can find lots of different sites. You can find it on the college's website in their common data set. You can find it on a bunch of the different college search tools, everything from Niche and their tool to the College Board's Big Future to the federal government's, the college scorecard. But know their admission cycle. Where are my odds of success best? It's worth asking this question. Colleges most willing to negotiate. The first kind of schools that are the most willing to negotiate are the lesser known regional private colleges. A lot of these schools are fantastic schools. They just don't have the luxury of having some billion-dollar funder and having a giant endowment, so they're not as well known. But they're oftentimes really, really good, and oftentimes they're great bang for your buck schools. And there's a ton of them on the West Coast. These schools are oftentimes just dealing with the realities of the demographics I talked about earlier, and they have already embraced, maybe decades ago, that high sticker price, high discount model. So they're perfectly positioned to be willing to listen to appeal. And if you're on the hook and maybe would go there for a little bit better price, they're much more willing to negotiate and to give you a little bit better price. The second category of schools is the less popular out-of-state flagships. This is out-of-state students only. This isn't for in-state schools. This is out-of-state. And there are out-of-state flagships that everybody's heard of, that everybody wants to go to. For folks in California, obviously, places like the University of Washington or the University of Michigan or Ohio State or the University of Virginia, University of Texas. These are at Austin. These are big, very popular flagships, the main school in that campus. And they get tons of applications from students out of state. But there's a whole bunch of other flagships that don't. And those are the ones that are more willing to negotiate. In the West, one of the ways to tell, by the way, in the West, most of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the Western University Exchange. Most of us just call it WUI. And if you want to go to one of the other schools in that exchange, you can look on the WUI website, say that 10 times fast, and find which public institutions will give you that WUI discount. And you'll see that there are some schools that will only do it for a very small number of programs. And there are other schools that'll do it for every single program they've got. And a version of the less popular flagship here might be, for example, the University of Wyoming or the University of Idaho versus University of Arizona or University of Washington, like I mentioned before. And then third, there's that other category of in-state regional publics. I mentioned this earlier. There are a bunch of Cal State schools that have dropped in enrollment substantially from where they were. These are the kind of schools where they've all got more supply than they have demand. And it's those schools where they're most willing to negotiate. I should say, most willing to grant your appeal. Okay. In your own circumstances, it's going to be really valuable here to think about this from your own perspective for a second, because I can tell you these big categories of schools, but you're thinking, well, for me personally, how do I do this? Well, think about it this way. The schools, if you're going to give yourself a chance to negotiate and give yourself some leverage, a couple of things tend to play out. One of them is that school that's on your final list, but it's like your second choice, somehow, some way, it's really weird. Those schools always seem to get that you're their second choice and they want to be the first choice. So that school, oddly, is just more likely to be willing to sweeten the pot a little bit. The nemesis of your first choice, that major competitor of your first choice school, this is something that is a really interesting strategy move. A lot of folks are doing this now, where they'll pick a school that they really want to go to. That's their first choice. And then they'll look up and figure out what's the biggest competitor from the perspective of that first choice college. And they'll send an application to that big competitor, just so that if they get accepted by that big competitor and they get a better price, they can use that one as leverage. And then third, most everybody gets a boatload of brochures and emails and all kinds of other stuff from colleges trying to get you interested in their school. And there are some that you hear from a lot. You know who they are. Those are the schools that are also very willing to negotiate. And you can utilize all of these as leverage. The fourth rule of getting a better price: know the college's competitors. Colleges and universities are businesses, and they're also, let's just say, sometimes insecure. And they are very aware of their competitors, especially the private colleges. So if you know their competitors, that will help you a whole bunch to set up for yourself a way of giving yourself the best leverage, the most ammunition to help with that appeal. All right, so how do you negotiate with a college? I want to present to you a strategic framework, a way of navigating this process. It's not a guarantee. Not every appeal works, but you want to put yourself in the position where you have the best chance of success. The worst thing that can happen to you in the appeal process, by the way, is no, we can't change your price, but yes, we still really want you to come. That's the worst thing that can happen. So if you want to think about this framework, let's organize it into 5 points. And I'll talk about each one of those here in just a second. Let's start with knowing the process. You really need to find out the college's appeal procedure. Remember when I talked about earlier how colleges went from a very informal process to a formalized process that was actually pretty similar to other schools? Most of the time, the process is going to look the same with little tweaks here and there, but those little tweaks matter. And every school will have this information somewhere. Most of the time it's on their website, although sometimes it's not the easiest to find it. You can use the search bar at the top of those schools' websites. Usually just type in, how do I appeal my financial aid offer? But find out this school's appeal procedure. And you'll want to know that because you'll want to follow it. They won't really have much skill at dealing with this if you try to go rogue. So first of all, find out that process. Part of that process is going to be at the very beginning, you're going to need to describe your case clearly and concisely. Now, concisely is incredibly important here. I have seen plenty of folks end up with 3-page deep detail, and the college doesn't have the time to deal with that. So you want to be able to articulate your situation clearly and concisely. They're probably going to ask you for some documentation, something that justifies the case you're trying to make. That documentation could be offers from other schools. It could be evidence of a change in your financial situation, but they are going to ask you for documentation and you are going to need to provide it. Remember this, the college is actually stuck in the middle in this because the college's financial aid office is compelled by a whole bunch of Department of Education policies and procedures. And at any time, the Department of Education could come to the college and say, we are auditing you. We want to see all of your records. We want to see that you're actually doing this the right way, that you're giving out aid appropriately and fairly, and that any changes you've made in somebody's financial aid offer is justified. So they're going to need to see all of that documentation. All those auditors from the Department of Education going to need to see all that stuff. So the school, when they're asking for this information, they're not just asking to be difficult. They're also asking because they need it in case the Department of Education comes along. Number 4, you are going to have to follow up and you're going to have to follow through. The follow through is going to be when they ask for additional information or they have other questions and maybe want to meet and have another conversation about something. The follow up, the follow up is going to be a function of the fact that financial aid offices are bombarded with requests and they are dealing with both the current students at that school and new incoming students and potential incoming students. So they may just get a backlog of things. They're also not super thrilled to give you a better price because that's money they don't get, right? So you'll need to follow up and stay on top of things as it goes through the process. And then finally, you need to keep notes from every conversation. It's just incredibly important to have clear records of everything that you communicated about on the phone or in person and save all those emails because you just never know what you'll need and what will be in those conversations that you'll need later. Understanding the dynamics. And what I mean by that is the dynamics of your relationship with the folks you speak to at that institution and the dynamics of the offices in that college or university and how they interact with each other. Because that's also incredibly important too. It's not uncommon at all for you to need to talk to multiple offices, admissions and financial aid at a particular university. And in some cases, those offices are actually not encouraged to speak with each other. Sometimes they're actually not allowed to speak to each other. As much as you get this big happy family vibe when you visit a campus, I can tell you from working in colleges, universities for decades, that a lot of times they don't talk to each other as much as they should. Sometimes they don't talk to each other much at all, and they don't even necessarily want to. So understand that something you said to one person in one office may not have ever gotten to somebody at another office. And that's not because they're trying to be jerks. It's because they're a big, diffuse, spread out space. If you can have multiple rationales to make your case, that will really make your case stronger, and it will allow you to make those cases, bring those rationales forward to different people in different ways based on the offices that they're in. This is a really important thing because admissions oftentimes thinks about any of this stuff through the lens of merit awards. Financial aid thinks about it through the lens of need-based awards, and those two may not be particularly interested in talking about the other part of the conversation. It's so important to be polite, be professional, and be present in every conversation. Don't try to, get hung up on you're still mad about the last conversation or still annoyed about somebody's comment, and you bring it into the conversation you're currently having. It's incredibly important that you are polite, professional, and present. It's your student, I know that. But the college and the person you're talking to, for them, it's one of hundreds, thousands of students. And they don't have that same kind of connection. So it's easy for the mom and dad to get emotional about this and fired up about it. And that doesn't help in the dynamic. The other thing that's really important to understand is admissions people in the admissions office, they're people persons. They're outgoing. They're oftentimes very extroverted. They love to talk about stuff, love to be happy for you, for your student success, all this other stuff. And they're kind of the sales staff. The financial aid folks are the number crunchers, and they're not necessarily the same as admissions. They're oftentimes less extroverted, sometimes downright introverted. They don't like to talk about disagreements. They don't want to be in conflict. So navigating those two different people types can be incredibly valuable. If you know you're going to talk to financial aid, sort of slow the tape down a little bit. With admissions, you can be up and up and up. But financial aid, it's really important to be facts, details, facts, rationale, logic. They're just oftentimes they're two very different types of people. Now, realistic here really does matter. It's super important to have a clear sense of what you're walking into. And a question to start with is how comparable, how fair is the price you already have been offered? Now, you might think that you can't know that, right? You don't know what everybody else has been offered. There's a site that is out there. It's called tuitionfit.org. And you can use it for free to upload award letters and then see how those offers compare with offers that other students have received. And sometimes you'll see other offers from the very same school offered to students like yours. That's exactly what you need to be able to figure out if this is a comparable price or if you're getting a great deal and you should jump on it, or they've sort of offered a little bit lighter offer than what similar schools are offering or what that same school is offering students like you. Can really be helpful to get a sense of where that price is in the broader landscape. And we're used to being able to get that information so easily on the internet when we're shopping for a house, shopping for a car, shopping for insurance. That stuff's all over the place. College is a little tougher. So use tuitionfit.org. That'll help you. How selective is the college? And where are you in the admissions cycle? Remember, we talked about this earlier. It is so important to understand that as you're going into the process. If you've been admitted early decision, but you've been waiting and waiting and waiting, and you've waited too long, that might be a little bit harder. You might just have to walk away. What's the gap between what the college's price is and what they want, what you want their price to be? When you go into the appeal process and go into negotiating, you're not going to get tens of thousands of more in financial aid very often. In fact, very rarely, unless the school's made a really serious error in their assessment of your student, their application, or your financial situation. More often than not, it's going to be $5,000 or less. And oftentimes, it might just be a couple of thousand a year. So if you're looking at an offer from a school and it's $30,000 away from where that needs to be, go into the negotiation process if you want, but know that it's going to be very difficult to get them anywhere close to where you need them to be. Just know that. And that leads to a really important question you need to ask yourself. Can you walk away? If you don't think you can walk away, and the school gets the sense that you're not going to walk away, you just want a better price, but you'll still come no matter what, they're just going to wait you out because you're going there anyway, right? I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but it is so important. And I've seen plenty of appeals, concerns about price, late conversations really go off the rails because folks really had a hard time managing their emotions. I know it feels personal. I know this feels personal. But from the college's perspective, it's not. It's really not. And in some ways, it shouldn't be for you either, because what we know about college student success is that your student is going to succeed because of who they are, no matter what school they go to. That leads to the second question. Are you and your student really on the same page? Talking about this stuff ahead of time can be really helpful, especially if you're not sure you're on the same page. If the student is just completely come hell or high water, I'm going to a school, mom and dad are sort of like, well, whatever, that can lead to some really difficult challenges in the family dynamic later. And nobody wants that. Think about what answers you might get when you appeal. Are you ready for no? They might say no. That can happen. What are you going to do if they say no? A lot of times the smart strategy with appealing is when they say no, appeal again and make your case again. Again, there's nothing negative that can happen there. But if you need the price to move, you can say, okay, I don't think you really heard me last time, so let's see if I can explain this better. Are you ready for a partial yes? That happens all the time. Family really wants $5,000 more in aid and the school offers $1,500. What are you going to do if they do that? Think these eventualities through and plan for it. That's a great way to manage the emotion here. And lastly, how do you like the backup plan? The backup plan maybe shouldn't be the backup plan. But the way to get to a place where you can imagine where you're going to be more successful is imagine each of those backup plans and imagine them making sense, working out, being great. And see yourself, can you see yourself into each of those plans, those backup plans? Because if you can do that, this process will be less emotional and you'll be more effective in making your case. And the outcome will be better, no matter what it is. This year more than ever, colleges and universities are going to be slammed by appeals. And they've only got so many people to go through all of those appeals. So be prepared to wait. And I guess the question is are you prepared to wait? Some people, waiting is really, really tough. Doesn't mean you shouldn't appeal. It just means maybe you should work through what that's going to look like. And lastly, be persistent. You are asking the colleges to do something they don't want to do. It's capitalism 101. They want you to pay more. You want to pay less. You're going to be asking them to do something they don't want to do. So you're going to have to be persistent to get them to engage that question. This year, because of all the delays, because of the new FAFSA formula and its effect on making all of the historical data that colleges keep kind of irrelevant, they're going to be swamped and they're going to be overwhelmed. They might misplace something. They might just be unable to catch up. They might said, look, we'll be back to you in a week, and in 2 weeks you haven't heard from them. That's entirely possible this year. one of the things that we found out is that the software the colleges use to process all this stuff really isn't all that nimble when the FAFSA data gets delayed or gets changed or has some other issues that are exactly what's happened this year. So that's going to just complicate things even more from the college's perspective. And if this year wasn't bad, the pandemic really made life hard on financial aid offices. And a lot of folks quit the profession. Now, doesn't mean everybody's short 5 or 6 staff members, but financial aid offices have chronically been small offices anyway. So combine that with all of what's going on now and what went on a couple of years ago, it's not going to be unlikely for you to be dealing with a financial aid office that wishes they had 6 people but only has 4. So just know that going in. Okay. I know I gave you a lot of information. I threw a lot of questions at you, a lot of stuff. But what I'd love to do is make sure that we have some time to answer some questions. You can put them in the chat. And Maddie, I know you can manage the chat pretty well. I am still seeing the display on my screen. So I'm going to just navigate from here. But what questions can I answer? Are these questions that, Maddie, when you talk to families, what do you tend to hear in this appeal process? All right, I think they've got some. Okay, a couple of questions here. If you're appealing, this is a great question, and thanks for sharing this. So, this is a question about the appeal. The question is about whether the discount will continue or whether it's just for 1 year. And that is a great question. These are the kinds of things that you really want to ask about as you go through this process. Because a lot of times what will happen here is that the college might just offer some financial aid over 1 year. And you want to pay attention to what those offers are and what they say, because this is one way to compare. But it is not uncommon for a college to say, well, we'll give you a little bit of extra money, but not necessarily every year. And certainly you want those funds to be every year. It's a great question. What other questions can I answer for you? Well, there being no other questions, thank you very much to everybody for joining the webinar today. If you need to get a recording of this, if there's parts of it that you want to check out, we'll get the link to this recording with the interpreters that we have. And thanks to Sean and Carrie and Leanne for adding their interpretations. I really appreciate it. Yes, Nikki, of course, you can absolutely add one more question.
Oh yeah, quick question. I was just looking at the appeal process online for one of my daughter's schools, which is UC Santa Cruz, and they say newly admitted students cannot formally appeal until after committing to UC Santa Cruz. Alternately, you may contact our office for an updated estimate. Is that updated estimate like an informal appeal, or how do you read behind the lines?
That's a great question. This is going to be this is just a goofy year for everyone, and a lot of schools are doing something right now where they sort of throw out their estimated offers and then say, well, we'll get you the stuff that when it's formal, when we get the FAFSA data. This is particularly true for the California publics because they're sort of so tied to FAFSA data. So one of the things that colleges do is they're going to try to shape this process beyond the sort of weirdness of this year. They're also going to try to shape this process to say, we won't negotiate. This is an interesting one. We're not going to listen to an appeal unless you've already sent in a tuition deposit. One of the things colleges are seeing is more and more students sending tuition deposits to multiple colleges and positioning themselves this way because, look, if you're not going to see the marketplace, I want to play this process out because the money I save with a better price is a lot more than the cost of that little tuition deposit. So what I would do with Santa Cruz is I would really reach out to them and ask them to clarify that and say, are you really saying that I can't ask you for a better price or a different price until I've actually submitted what I'm guessing is probably a non-refundable deposit? So Santa Cruz, you're asking me to send you money that I can't get back before we talk about whether we can get to a price that fits my price range. And just pin them down a little bit there and see what they do. Because they'll probably squirm a little bit. And you're probably not the first person to ask this question.
Okay.
Is that helpful, Nikki?
That's very helpful. Thank you.
Sure, absolutely. What other questions that can I answer for anybody? And it's more than okay to just unmute yourself and go ahead and ask directly if that's easier than typing it into the chat. Okay. Well, I'm not going to make you sit here and stare at me in silence while I stare at you in silence. So thanks very much to everybody who joined. And we have one more webinar coming up in a little less than a month. And I will see you then. In the meantime, have a great evening, everyone.